afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the TOA Canada monthly webinar. Today we're going to go over the new QRM 9012 and the QSS 9012 devices. These units have come to TOA basically to get into the market of having a microphone that allows you to do multiple zone paging. Before, we really only were able to do zone paging via the telephone or with a separate single output microphone along with a separate switching device. So now we basically have a device that will work in conjunction with both boxes and our 9000 series of units. So now we're going to look at the product features for both these units. Now, depending on how you set up this system, you could either go either with the QSS 9012 or just with the microphone by itself connected to the 9000. We'll go over that a little bit later in the presentation. So basically keep in mind it really depends on how large and big a system you want to go. So initially out of the box you do have access of up to 12 zones of paging with a single microphone. You also have the ability to use a single power amplifier to page to multiple zones using the QSS 9012. The microphone itself is a condenser microphone with a balanced line output. And a couple other features that we threw in there on the actual button interface is an all-call capability, a clear button to cancel any zone paging, and like I said, you have the individual buttons to either build up or select the zones you want to page to. Taking a look at the basically top overhead view of the QRM 9012, it's quite a simple layout. If you start from the upper left, looking at the power indicator, we have a single button for all-call, which is basically for do all your zones at once. And then we have your call buttons. So from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, essentially the left does start at 11 and 12, the bottom one being clear. And then if you look up the upper right-hand side, that's your 1 to 10 buttons. So once you select the buttons to which zone you want to page to, either a single or multiple, all you got to do at that point would be pressing the call button at the bottom to initiate your page. Now this unit might look familiar, as it is referenced from our VM 2000 series microphone. They basically rebuilt that main cabinet itself, changed the color, and reused the units. So people that are familiar with that current system will have no problem paging with this one. Taking a look at the back of the microphone itself, you can see our connections that are available. You have your 24-volt DC input for the microphone itself, and then you got your two Cat5 terminal jacks connectors in the back. The last thing you'll see on the right-hand side is your mic gain level. So all that is available to you for connections. Your mic gain level will allow you to bring up or down your microphone directly from the unit itself without using any either front panel software enabled, etc. Devices that are going to be external from the unit itself. And if you take a look at the connector block at the bottom, you'll see how we have the two Cat5 connector jacks and how they're set up. Essentially, your first three terminals on the left are going to be your hot, cold, and earth for the microphone signal itself. Again, that is balanced. And then you'll see we have a shared ground on terminal 4, and then our closures for basically outputs 1 to 12. So essentially what happens when you do press a single button, whatever button that does associate to, when you do press that button, it'll give you an open collector closure on that terminal, which will thus send a signal down to the cables to your connected device. Okay, so if we move on to the QSS 912, I got three kind of views here for you to take a look at. So if you look at the top section there, that's going to be the front panel of the QSS 912. Basically has your 12 LED indications. So anytime you press a button, the LED will light up to the corresponding zone that you press. This is kind of handy if you have this unit kind of installed remotely away from the microphone where someone could be monitoring the system. So they have a handy visual feature here they can relate to and view the zones that way. If you take a look at the second middle photo there, that's the top view. It's basically a painted on diagram there to kind of give you an idea how the system flows and operates. So if you take a look at the left kind of middle section there, your speaker zone outputs, those are where you're going to connect your physical speaker lines to. So your zones 1 to 12 essentially will be lined up individually on those terminals. And you'll see right above that the relay switch itself. Basically once that's flipped over, when it sees the signal come in, essentially it'll pass the signal out to your speakers. And then you look at the second kind of picture there where it says C in from the 9012. That's basically the feed itself being fed through our 9000 from the 9012 into the units. So essentially, whenever any one of those physical relays there see a signal come in, it will then flip the associated relay to the output side. Lastly, if you look on the right-hand side, you have your paging and line inputs. That's your feed essentially coming in from your amplifier. So once your amplifier has power through the paging inputs, it's going to be there active all the time, and it will not obviously pass anything through to the channel until it sees the appropriate relay associated to the output channel to trip that output and page to your speaker. And if you look at the bottom there, you got a little black and white view of the back plane. Essentially, there's your terminal strips there, your feedings connectors on the back there, essentially with your outputs associated, and then your inputs, of course, and then your amplifier in line in. The line in can be used as an example just for BGM. If you want to have background music kind of running all the time, that's an additional feature that they threw in there, and that way when you do page, it'll essentially just override that and go out to your speakers. So this is something else to kind of think of that way. So the connections, here's your options here. So like I said, single amplifier, your basic requirements would be the following, which would be the QRM 9012 mic, the QSS 9012 switch selector box, your power supply, and then your 9000 series of mixer amplifiers. Keep in mind that QSS 9012 handles up to 240 watts maximum power. So keep that in mind if you're having any external power amplifiers that power the system. And then, of course, running with the 9000 series, you will need your input module, your D001T. That will take your mic level signal in, and then your C001T to allow for the additional closures to activate the QSS 9012. Now, the benefit of going with a single amplifier system, basically you have one amp in the whole system, that's it. So that power is basically allowing you to do 240 watts across, again, in total, across into the QSS 9012. So if you're looking for a stripped-down version, either an amplifier is already existing, or if it's a smaller type scenario setup, this will get you by pretty easily. All you'd be looking at would be a mixer amplifier like our 9000, 240-watt units, and then the two devices that connect the microphone, and you're basically up and running for paging. Now, we also can do this with a multiple amplifier setup. Now, what this entails would be the microphone itself, the power supply, the 9000 series mixer amplifier, and then a power amplifier per zone. Now, you also need your D module, your C module, and your T module, and basically that will allow you to build up a full 9000 series with your inputs and your full 8 outputs. Now, the benefit of doing this way would allow you to give you one amplifier per zone, which will give you more available power to those zones. So if you're doing a large application for possible, say, a warehouse application with a lot of paging horns, you're most likely going to exceed 240 watts per zone. So what this entails you to do is give you a possibility of maybe going with our DA series amplifier and getting 500 watts per zone. So here's your single amplifier connection. So what you notice on the bottom right there is up to 12 zones. That single line is just kind of showing you the line going out to each zone. That's not in parallel. I just want to give you an idea of how it looks. So essentially, if we're going to start from the left, you get your microphone coming in. So you have your hot, cold, and earth signal coming into the 9000 on D module. And then you have your C outs from that QRM on the first Cat5 coming out as well. You also have your second Cat5 coming out of that microphone. And those are all going to be fed into the 9000 series of mixer amp. So anytime those buttons are pressed, they're going to activate that corresponding open collector to tell a 9000, hey, I'm going to page to that zone. So at that point, once the 9000 does see that, and I'll show this to you in the corresponding software program, once it does see that signal coming in and that closure associated to that button, it's going to now give you a page to the output and open a relay on the 9000 to flip the QSS 9012. So what essentially you're doing is you're basically having your power there constantly there. It's always open and going to be constantly there. At that point is The QSS 912, all it cares about is when that closure is going to be activated to open that doorway, essentially, to allow you to page. So at the bottom there, you see you have 12 physical connected zones coming from the QSS 912 to your zones. So you have 12 separate runs if you want to do 12 full zones for that. Now, taking a look at the software, this is how this would lay out for you. So now what you're going to look at is once you've assigned your QRM 912 as an input, you're going to head right over to paging. You'll give it a priority level, most likely 1 if you're just going to have a QRM to do the paging. And essentially, you'll see in the bottom frame there, I'm going to choose a QRM every time I want to pick a single zone. So you'll see in there at the bottom, from 1 to 12, I have my 12 associated QRMs, which is again a single unit. However, you'll see the trigger as being CN1 to CN12. So again, every time I press a button, regardless of what button it is on the microphone, I'm going to activate a single open collector on the 9000 to open up that path. You also see I've only selected channel output 1 because basically none of these channels will operate until that channel 1 output channel path is associated and going to send a signal there. So anytime I press button 1, 2, 3, whatever it is, that's going to open that output 1 and send that full 240 watts out every time. And the key here is you'll see now we've added a sync out feature on the far right. So you see if I've selected out 12 individual outputs to fire off when I press that associated input button. So now you can kind of see the path as established here. You have a QRM firing off the signal. It's choosing an individual trigger point. It's now pulling the single output channel of the amplifier, in this case, say 240 watts. It's basically, again, like I said, opening that doorway by syncing out its own contact output to go to the QSS 9012 to do that zone paging. Now, if we look at it a different way with multiple amplifier connections, you're going to need, in this scenario, an amplifier channel, a physical power channel per zone. You'll also need your output modules on the 9000 in order to fire that off. So essentially what we're doing here is we're taking the same 2 cables. We're going to run them to the 9000 like we did in the other scenario. But this time we don't need the QSS 912 because we're not actually sharing an amplifier to power and going back through a relay switching box. We're actually just going to tell the 9000 at this point is when you see button, say input 1 activated, and then you see a closure associated to it, I want to designate that as a page. At that point, you're going to tell the 9000 where you want to steer that paging. So in this scenario here, we have 8 individual outputs, and now these are going to be fired off to those zones. So you'll see here I have 2 DA 4-channel amplifiers here to give me my 8 zones. Now, do keep in mind in this scenario, you only can get up to a maximum of 8 zones when doing this, because the 9000 itself only has 8 physical outputs, so we can't do more than that, whereas the previous version, the QSS 912, that's all relay-based, so essentially that does have 12 physical relays on there. So as long as you have the same amount of relays firing that off, then we can do that in that scenario up to 12. So take a look at the next page here, and we'll show you how it works with the software. So now if we look at the software side of things for the multiple amplifier programming, like I mentioned earlier, you are limited to 8 zones in this scenario, but obviously you will get more power on the output side. So essentially what you're going to be doing is taking the 9000, loading it up with the TOA output modules to give you 8 physical line outputs. From there, that's what we'll be feeding that into your power amplifier. So essentially, like I said, you can go from 240 watts in the original scenario now anywhere up to 500 or whatever power you have available at that point. So looking at the left side of the bottom left there, you see your activation inputs there, the QRMs, and then the associated triggers. So we have our CN1 to 8, which will allow us to do 8 zones, and then we have our outputs. So now in this scenario, you'll see output channels 1 to 8, and they stagger across each individual output. So now what we're doing here is physically firing off that line output for zone 1 to 8. Take a look at the top right there, you see there are named 1 to 8. So only one at a time will be fired off when I press that associated button, or if I press multiple buttons, the same thing will apply as I can build up zones and do it that way. So it really depends on the scenario and setup you have. Smaller systems would be best to go with just the QSS 9012, the microphone itself, and then our mixer amplifier, the 9000 series. Whereas larger, more power, full system that require multiple, say, horns, or you're doing a large warehouse, then you'll most likely want to strip that down a little bit down to an 8-zone system to allow you to do your full power that's going to be required for that type of setup. So applications, I chose a few here. Mostly those will be geared towards warehouses, office buildings, sports complexes, workout facilities, and possibly schools, plus many more. It really depends on what your client's looking for. We see tenders here and there that do come across that still require microphone paging, so just keep that in mind when doing designs, that we do have a product for that. We can do up to 12 zones if needed with a single amplifier, or if you do multiple zones up to 8 with more power, then we can definitely do that with just 8-zone units and more power for amplifier.